Okay, welcome back to Tips and Tricks for Better Cytology Samples. I am Dr. Corey Yerokis, and I am a veterinary clinical pathologist on Zoetis's digital cytology team, and I'm on the other side of your imagist reading your samples for you. And for today's episode of Tips and Tricks, we are going to talk about some common cytology prep errors to avoid and how they actually impact your samples. I think one of the biggest challenges with spreading the samples is you're afraid to break your cells, right? You've gone through all of the work to collect them. You've gotten them on the slide. The last thing that you want to do is break them and get the report that all the cells are ruptured. And what do I do now? Because it's always the cranky animals that this happens to, right? So totally get that. I was one of those as well. But what we want to make sure is sometimes even with the best intentioned methods to minimize cell breakage, we actually end up creating samples that can't be read. And so I have a couple of the most common kind of prep errors that are made sort of in an effort to maintain cell integrity, but actually are counterproductive. So let's go ahead and take a look at these first two preps. This is usually what happens when a cytology sample is placed on a slide, and then the spreader slide is taken and squashed on top of the sample and lifted directly up instead of spread evenly across the slide. And again, this is often done to decrease cell breakage, but what actually happens is have you ever pulled the peanut butter part of a bread away from the jelly and seen how it all everything just sticks together? So this is what happens with the slide. You create a sample that has a lot of nooks and crannies and crevices. And when you go to stain that slide, the stain will either pull down in the canyons or get stuck up on the valleys. And you actually get really, really uneven staining. Also, what happens is we lose any sort of cell pattern when we do this. And this is especially important for liver samples, spleen samples, where pathologists such as myself really rely on how the cells are distributed and where things are in relation to each other to figure out what's going on. And when you have these type of preps, we kind of lose that. We lose any sort of pattern that's there and everything gets chunked up together. And it's really, really hard to see. The only time that we would be able to really work with these sort of samples when you want to use them is when you're doing a impression smear of a biopsy sample that you've taken out of the animal. And to make those, obviously you are going to be blotting them along the slide, but you want to make sure that you are doing a fresh cut surface. So just not the surface of the mass itself, but go ahead and make a slice through it, and then go ahead and do impressions of that cut surface on the slide, because that way I'll be able to see what's inside the tumor rather than what is just on the outside. But for your cytology samples, you really don't want them to look like these images. Another method that I've seen commonly is taking a needle and putting it into the sample and then dragging it across the sample, trying to make like little rivulets of sample. And again, in an effort to make sure that the cells in the sample don't rupture. But again, we've got a thick, uneven sample that results from that. So let's take a look a little bit closer and see why. So this is what those sandwich preps, those pull apart preps look like when they're stained. We've got an uneven staining here, and I have big islands of cells, and I can't tell who they are, unfortunately. Are they epithelial because they're all stuck together, or are they all aggregated macrophages? Are they spindle cells that are all stuck together? I just can't tell because they're not spread apart from their neighbors, so I'm not going to be able to say one way or another what it is. So yes, there are cells here. Yes, they are intact, but I can't see any of the details, so I'm not going to be able to do much with that sample. Here's another pitfall that I often see, and this is usually, again, just being afraid of spreading cells and afraid of breaking them. Again, totally get it, been there, done that myself. This is usually what happens when you're just popping the back of the syringe and squirting the sample onto the slide and calling it good and going ahead and staining it. Again, it's kind of the same problem that happened with our sandwich preps. Everything is just clumped together. We don't have the cells spread out from each other. And when the cells are applied to the slide from a height, so when the needle is not touching this surface of the slide, the cells are falling through midair and then exploding down onto the slide, and then everything's going to rupture. So again, totally understand wanting to just get this sample on the slide and then stain it and call it good. But when we don't spread it out, what we get is something like this, where is it very cellular? Yes, absolutely it is. But everything is squashed together. I can't see any of the cellular features, which is really frustrating on my end and frustrating for you because you know the sample is cellular. I know the sample is cellular, but I can't tell who these cells are. And even when we get out to the thinner areas of the slide, everything's broken. And that's usually because they have tumbled through the air and splatted onto the slide. And there's no coming back from that one. So unfortunately, this is what happens when we don't spread out our sample and when we are applying the sample to the slide, the needle is up in the air and not touching the slide. So what happens though if they keep breaking? So sometimes I would usually give myself two tries. Either I change up my aspiration technique and how I spread my spreading technique to get my sample spread. So I would change those up and give myself kind of a do-over. And I'd only give myself one do-over though, because if the samples are still, if your cells are still breaking, 99% of the time, it's not you, it's them. Some of these cells from tumors are extremely fragile. Lymph nodes being ACE number one. Lymphoma lymphocytes are extremely fragile. And sometimes you can have the most impeccable technique on earth, but those buggers are still going to rupture no matter what you do. So if you're getting a second report back from me, that's saying, sorry, the cells are ruptured again, it's the lesion's fault and it's not you. And that's when we usually have to take the next step in biopsy. So if you're getting repeated results, you've changed up your technique, you've changed up your aspiration technique, but everything is still ruptured, it's the lesion's fault and it's not going to be you. So hopefully we've talked through a few pitfalls for cytology samples, kind of more of like a do not please sort of approach to this video, but just wanted to explain, why we get some of the preps that we do. I understand why we do, but also show you what they look like on my end and why they're not the most diagnostic choice. So hopefully you were able to take some of that back with you to your practice, able to adjust your technique and improve those cytology samples. Thanks so much for listening.